What if I told you the most powerful man in England was literally rotting alive while sitting on the throne? Not metaphorically, not spiritually. His flesh was decaying. His wounds were oozing. His smell could clear a room before he even entered it. This was King Henry VIII, once a golden prince, now a walking corpse with a crown. By the end of his life, his body had become so grotesque, so foul, that even the people paid to serve him were vomiting from the stench. Imagine being forced to wheel a 400-pound monarch through the halls of a palace while chunks of his leg flesh fell off onto the marble floor, leaving a bloody trail of human rot behind him. Now imagine your job is to follow behind with a bucket and clean it up. This is not the Tudor king from your high school textbooks. This is not the charming tyrant from Netflix dramas. This is the raw, disgusting reality that history tries to bury because it stinks just as bad as he did. By the last decade of his life, Henry VIII had become a living horror movie. A man with leg ulcers so deep they oozed pus and blood every single day. A man whose servants stuffed perfumed cloths into their noses just to survive being in the same room. A man whose physicians were so repulsed by his condition that they risked treason just to avoid treating him. He wasn't feared because of royal power anymore. He was feared because of what he had become. And yet, no one could look away. Because when a king's body starts to rot from the inside out, it's not just a medical tragedy. It's a warning about what happens when power decays. And no one dares to stop it. But how does a man go from being England's golden boy to a bloated tyrant who smells like death? The answer may lie in a single bone-cracking moment, a moment that changed the course of history, rewired a royal brain, and unleashed a monster onto the throne of England. It was January 1536, Greenwich Palace. King Henry VIII, once a towering figure of athleticism and pride, entered a jousting tournament wearing his gleaming armor, ready to show the world he was still the strongest man in the kingdom. But what happened next would shatter that illusion forever. Henry was knocked clean off his horse. The full weight of his massive body crashed to the ground. He wasn't just bruised, he was unconscious for more than 2 hours. Let's be clear, this wasn't a nap. In today's medical terms, he was clinically dead, and when he finally opened his eyes, he wasn't the same man anymore. Witnesses at court began to whisper that something had shifted. At first it was subtle, his temper shorter, his patience thinner. But soon those closest to him began noticing something far more disturbing. The charming prince who had written poetry, played music, and composed love letters was gone. In his place stood a man who lashed out without warning, accused people of treason without evidence, and sent childhood friends to the executioner's block because of a passing thought or a bad dream. Modern neurologists who've studied Henry's life now believe he suffered a traumatic brain injury during that fall, one severe enough to damage the frontal lobe, the area of the brain responsible for impulse control, emotional regulation, and moral judgment. In other words, the part of your brain that separates a king from a killer. And as the months went on, that fracture in his mind grew into a cavern of cruelty. He became obsessed with control, terrified of betrayal, and worst of all, convinced that he was chosen by God not to lead, but to judge, punish, and destroy. The man who had once been loved for his wit and intelligence was now feared for his rage. He would smile at a courtier in the morning only to have them arrested for treason by nightfall. He would write love notes to his wife and sign her death warrant days later. It wasn't politics, it was pathology. Henry's paranoia escalated to terrifying new heights. He began sleeping with weapons under his pillow, daggers, pistols, even crossbows. Armed guards were posted inside his bedroom, ordered to stay awake all night just in case someone tried to kill him. But it wasn't assassins he feared. It was shadows, ghosts, his own mind. He had peepholes installed in walls so he could spy on his own courtiers. Secret passageways built through palaces not for escape but for sneaking up on people. Even his own daughters were assigned royal spies, watched like enemy agents, not beloved children. This wasn't leadership. This was a mind unraveling beneath a golden crown. And his victims. They weren't just rivals or traitors. They were anyone who got too close. Advisors, friends, servants, wives. Anne Boleyn, his second queen, once wrote that she no longer recognized the man she had married. His eyes were cold, his words unpredictable. She lived in constant fear that the next knock on the door would be the one that dragged her to the scaffold, and she was right. Henry VIII's reign became a courtroom of imagined crimes where people were sentenced not for what they did, but for what Henry dreamed they might do. One nobleman was executed simply because Henry had a nightmare in which the man betrayed him. Another was beheaded after someone else claimed they heard him mutter, "The king is fat," under his breath. When your king rules by dream and delusion, no one is safe. By the end of his life, Henry wasn't just a sick man. He was a sick system, a monarchy built on fear, where reality bent to fit his madness, and everyone in his orbit walked a tightrope over a pit of royal paranoia. But here's the most terrifying part. No one could stop him. Because when your body is falling apart, your mind is fractured, and your advisors are too afraid to speak the truth. You become something worse than a tyrant. You become a god in your own mind, and a nightmare in everyone else's. The brain-damaged tyrant was now fully awake, and he would rule not with reason or law, but with impulse fear and the haunting belief that every execution was justified by divine right. He didn't just lose his humanity in that fall from the horse. He lost the part of himself that knew what cruelty was, and England would pay the price. If you think Henry VIII's wives were just unlucky in love, you're not seeing the full horror. They weren't just queens. They were captives in a royal game of ego obsession and sadism, married to a man who didn't just kill women. He dismantled them piece by piece from the inside out. Everyone knows the rhyme divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that catchy little poem doesn't even begin to capture the psychological terror these women endured, because Henry didn't simply end their lives. He hunted their sanity first. Let's start with Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife and partner of 24 years. She wasn't just divorced, she was erased. When Henry decided he wanted Anne Boleyn instead, he didn't just ask Catherine for an annulment. He declared their entire marriage a sin, claimed their child was illegitimate, and forced Catherine to live in exile, forbidden to see her own daughter. He used their daughter Mary as a weapon, dangling visitations like emotional bait. Catherine was isolated, humiliated, and slowly broken down by a man who had once sworn eternal love. Some believe she died of cancer, others say she was poisoned, but anyone who's ever suffered under relentless emotional abuse knows this truth. She was killed long before she stopped breathing. And then came Anne Boleyn. She was everything Catherine wasn't: young, bold, and clever. Henry chased her for 7 years, then discarded her in less than 3. But it wasn't enough to get rid of her. He had to destroy her reputation, her family, and her mind. Henry fabricated an entire conspiracy, accusing Anne of sleeping with 5 men, including her own brother. He had them all arrested, tortured, and executed while Anne was forced to watch. She stood in the Tower of London knowing her brother's severed head would fall before hers. She waited for the sound of footsteps on stone, not knowing if they carried mercy or death. And when the executioner finally arrived, imported from France supposedly as a favor, he didn't bring comfort. He brought delay. Anne spent days in solitary limbo, swinging between hysteria and eerie calm, wondering when the sword would drop. It wasn't just an execution, it was a psychological crucifixion. But if Anne's story was terrifying, Catherine Howard's was a straight-up horror film. She was barely 19, a teenager, married off to a man in his late 40s, weighing over 400 pounds, reeking of ulcers and rot. Imagine being forced into bed with that. When Henry discovered she'd had past relationships, not affairs during their marriage, but boyfriends from her youth, he lost his mind. He passed a law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without revealing their entire sexual history. Yes, he rewrote national law, because his teenage wife wasn't a virgin. Then he locked her in the tower, but not to kill her right away. He sent messengers daily. One day they promised a pardon. The next, they described in detail how her head would be removed. Guards reported hearing her scream through the night, fall silent for hours, then break again. By the time she was led to the scaffold, she looked decades older, a girl whose mind had been broken by weeks of terror. And still, he wasn't done. His luckiest wife, Jane Seymour, died of natural causes after giving birth to Henry's long-awaited male heir. But even that moment was soaked in blood and brutality. Jane was in labor for over 30 hours, screaming in agony. But doctors prioritized saving the baby on Henry's orders. Her life was secondary. She was a vessel, a tool. She died days later. And within 9 days of her funeral, Henry began negotiating his next marriage. Do you see the pattern? These weren't marriages. They were executions on delay. Even Anne of Cleves, the wife who survived, did so only because she agreed to pretend the marriage never happened under threat of death. She smiled. She submitted. She thanked him for not killing her. That was the price of survival. And then there was Catherine Parr, the final wife, the survivor, but barely. Henry had already signed her arrest warrant when she discovered it. Her crime talking too much about religion. So she threw herself at his feet, played the role of obedient student, and told him she was merely seeking his divine wisdom. That lie saved her life. But imagine living every day knowing that your husband could kill you at breakfast if he didn't like what you said at dinner. These women weren't just victims of politics. They were victims of a man who got off on control, who twisted love into punishment, and who saw their minds as toys to be played with before the body was discarded. Henry VIII didn't just have 6 wives, he had 6 hostages. And the most disturbing truth, none of them could escape. In Tudor England, divorce wasn't an option. Running away was treason. Defending yourself meant death for you and your family. Their only way out was to suffer until he got bored, or until the axe came down. By now you know what kind of man Henry VIII had become. But to truly understand the monster inside the king, you have to look at his dining room. Because Henry didn't just rule England with a sword, he ruled it with his fork. His appetite wasn't just excessive, it was theatrical, ritualistic, and at times, almost religious. For most people, meals are about nourishment. For Henry, eating was power. And every dinner became a royal performance, one that blurred the line between gluttony, paranoia, and madness. Let's start with the numbers. By the final years of his life, Henry was consuming over 5,000 calories per day, more than double what an active man needs. But Henry wasn't active. He could barely walk. He required mechanical devices just to move from one room to another. And yet he gorged himself daily on entire pigs, chickens, ducks, swans, deer pies, puddings, and rivers of wine. A single banquet might feature dozens of dishes prepared by a kitchen staff of over 200 people, a workforce larger than some restaurants today. But it wasn't just about quantity. Henry believed food had magical properties. He ate swan to become more graceful. He devoured venison to make himself a better hunter despite being too obese to ride a horse. And, most disturbingly, he swallowed platefuls of oysters to boost his sexual performance. As if oysters could somehow erase the stench of rotting leg ulcers or hide the fact that his body was collapsing under its own weight. But here's where the meal turned from indulgent to terrifying. Every single bite the king took was pre-tested for poison. Not once, not twice, but by multiple food tasters who were forced to wait 30 minutes after sampling just in case they dropped dead from delayed toxins. Even the salt, spices, and water were tested separately. The kitchen was guarded like a war room. Servants were watched by other servants. The guards who watched the chefs were themselves being watched. Why? Because Henry believed that every plate might be his last. And so the act of feeding the king became a military operation, a paranoid pageant where the wrong spice or the wrong cough could get you accused of treason. But the most disturbing part wasn't the food, it was the audience. Because Henry didn't eat in private. He dined in public, in full view of his courtiers. Hundreds of nobles were required to attend his meals to watch in silence as he devoured enough food to feed a village. Even as the smell from his infected legs filled the room, even as flesh visibly peeled off under his robes, They had to sit there smiling, nodding, pretending this was royal majesty. They had to applaud the performance or risk losing their heads. Imagine that, being forced to watch your king gorge himself until he vomited, then continue eating while servants wiped the floor clean beneath him. It wasn't dinner, it was psychological domination, a ritual that said, "You will honor me even as I decay. You will worship me even as I rot before your eyes." And the cost of this grotesque indulgence wasn't just dignity, it was national. While Henry stuffed himself with gilded meats and spiced custards, the English countryside was starving. Bad harvests, rising prices, and failing infrastructure left entire villages without enough grain to survive the winter. But the king's kitchens, they were overflowing, discarding literal tons of food daily. Leftovers were fed to dogs or thrown away rather than given to the poor. It was an empire of excess built on the backs of a hungry population, and it gets worse. Contemporary reports describe Henry making major decisions: military campaigns, executions, foreign treaties, while he was completely stuffed or drunk on wine. There were days when the fate of entire families was decided in a room that smelled of meat, grease, sweat, and rotting flesh by a man who could barely stay conscious between gulps. By the end, even his own doctors knew the truth. The food was killing him. His ulcers worsened. His weight skyrocketed. His bowels failed. He could barely breathe while seated. And yet, no one dared to tell him to stop, because telling the king the truth was more dangerous than letting him die. So they smiled and served him more. They watched as Henry devoured himself to death like a fire consuming its own wood. And through it all, he believed he was in control. But the truth, the monster at the dinner table wasn't in command. He was a prisoner of his own appetite, using food to drown pain, boredom, loneliness, and to remind the world he was still king, even as he was falling apart. This wasn't a royal meal. This was a slow-motion execution. And it wasn't just Henry who suffered. The court suffered. The nation suffered. Everyone forced to watch became complicit, because in Tudor England, the most dangerous place to be was sitting too close to the king while he ate. If watching Henry VIII devour mountains of food while rotting alive wasn't disturbing enough, just wait until you see how he ruled his kingdom. Because behind the feasts, the executions, and the gilded palaces, England had become a prison, and its jailer was the king himself. By the final years of his reign, Henry wasn't just a tyrant. He was a paranoid dictator, running a surveillance state, so twisted it would make modern intelligence agencies blush. Let's start with his bedroom. Henry VIII didn't sleep like a king. He slept like a man expecting to be murdered at any moment. Each night, his bed was surrounded by armed guards. He kept loaded crossbows and daggers under his pillow, sometimes more than one. And even those hand-picked guards, they were rotated every few hours because Henry believed if they stayed too long, they might start plotting against him. Even the people who watched the king sleep were being watched. Think about that level of paranoia. But it didn't stop when the sun rose. Henry had secret passageways built throughout his palaces, not for convenience, but for escape. He had peepholes installed in walls to spy on conversations. Chambers wired with crude listening holes so his advisors could never speak freely. This wasn't just architecture. It was the physical manifestation of a mind unraveling. The king had become a man who needed to see and hear everything, not out of curiosity, but out of fear. And what he feared most was being irrelevant. So he created a world where loyalty wasn't trusted, where friendship was dangerous, and where no one could speak the truth. Welcome to Henry VIII's court, where everyone was both a victim and a potential informant. Because the real terror wasn't the guards. It was the people standing next to you. Henry created a kingdom of spies. He had informants reporting on other informants. Courtiers were told to eavesdrop on their rivals. Even servants were ordered to spy on their masters. But the worst part, he weaponized families. Children were told to report on their parents. Spouses betrayed each other for royal favor. Siblings turned each other in, hoping to survive another day. Because in Henry's world, love was less valuable than loyalty, and loyalty meant nothing unless you could prove it by sacrificing someone else. This wasn't politics. This was systemic paranoia dressed in royal robes, and no one was safe. Henry had spies following his own daughters Mary and Elizabeth because he feared they might plot against him. Let that sink in. The same girls who had watched him destroy their mothers were now treated like enemy agents under their own father's roof. They were royal by blood, but in Henry's eyes they were potential threats. That's not just tyranny. That's psychological warfare against your own children. And it got even darker. Henry began ordering preemptive executions, killing people not for what they had done, but for what he feared they might do. One nobleman, the Marquis of Exeter, was loyal to the king for years, but Henry had a dream that the man betrayed him, and that was enough. He had him arrested, tortured, executed. Another man was beheaded simply because someone said he had looked at the king disrespectfully at court. When fear replaces evidence and dreams become death sentences, you're no longer living in a monarchy. You're surviving a reign of madness. Henry's obsession with loyalty led to a system where silence was safer than truth, and obedience was more important than competence. Great minds were ignored. Honest voices were silenced. And the only people who rose to power were those willing to lie, betray, and manipulate. Because in a kingdom where the king is always watching, only the most ruthless survive. And here's the final irony. The more Henry watched, the more he isolated himself. He created a web of surveillance so dense he couldn't trust anyone in it. He spent his final years surrounded by sycophants, cowards, and shadows. Everyone bowed. No one believed. And the fear he tried to use as control became the very thing that consumed him. England didn't just fear their king. They learned to fear each other. A glance, a whisper, a letter left unattended could cost you your family, your land, your life. And this legacy of mistrust didn't die with Henry. It lived on in his daughters. Mary, known to history as Bloody Mary, learned from the best. She ruled with fire and suspicion, burning her enemies real or imagined. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, trusted no one, never married, and built her own network of spies to survive. Because when you grow up in a world where your own father watches you like a traitor, you either become the next target or the next tyrant. Henry VIII didn't just create a surveillance state. He engineered generational trauma, and the echoes of that fear still linger in the way we tell stories about kings' loyalty and the terrifying cost of unchecked power. So the next time someone tells you Henry was a bold reformer or a charismatic ruler, remember this. He didn't just rule a nation. He turned it into a cage and called it a court. At some point, the line between a paranoid king and a murderous god starts to blur. And under Henry VIII, that line wasn't just crossed, it was obliterated. Because this wasn't just a man who punished betrayal. This was a man who killed people before they had the chance to betray him. He didn't need evidence. He didn't need confession. All he needed was a gut feeling, a strange dream, or a whisper from the wrong mouth at the wrong time. Welcome to the reign of Henry VIII, where suspicion was a death sentence and your loyalty didn't matter if the king had a nightmare about you. Let's talk about Henry Courtenay, the Marquis of Exeter. He was family, cousin to the king, loyal, trusted, high-ranking. And yet one night Henry VIII reportedly had a dream that Courtenay was plotting against him. No letter, no plan, no proof, just a dream. The next morning the Marquis was arrested. He was dragged from his home, interrogated, and eventually executed for treason. All because the king's subconscious didn't like him that night. Let that sink in. A man's entire life, status, bloodline, loyalty was wiped out by a vision in the king's sleep. But it didn't stop there. Henry's court became a place where people were punished for potential not actions. You could be executed not for what you did, but for what someone feared you might do someday. One servant was hanged after another courtier overheard him mutter under his breath that the king looked unwell. Not disrespectful, not treasonous, just unwell. In Henry's mind, even the slightest shadow of doubt was an act of rebellion, and this wasn't rare. Nobles, scholars, clergy, dozens were executed not for crime, but for being in the wrong place during the king's wrong mood, because by now, Henry was no longer ruling a kingdom. He was ruling a stage where everyone was performing for their lives, and the show was called Don't Give the King a Reason. Some tried silence, some tried flattery, but no one was safe. Because when your ruler is a man who sees divine judgment in his dreams, logic becomes treason, and loyalty is just camouflage. You could be a loyal subject on Monday, a prisoner on Tuesday, and a corpse by Friday. All it took was a look, a word, a dream. Take Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the English Reformation. The man who had served Henry faithfully for years, advised him, defended him, restructured his government. And yet, after arranging Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a union Henry despised, Cromwell was accused of treason and heresy. His trial was a joke. His sentence already decided. He was beheaded on Tower Hill. Why? Because Henry was embarrassed by a political match he had approved himself. In this world, serving the king was the most dangerous job of all, because if you failed him, you died. And if you succeeded too well, you threatened his ego and died faster. Even the accusation of disloyalty could spread like wildfire. Whispers were enough. One false rumor could wipe out an entire noble house. Some historians believe more than 70,000 people were executed during Henry's reign, many of them for actual crimes. But far too many for thoughts they never spoke, for deeds they never did, for dreams they didn't even have. And the public, they were watching. Every hanging, every beheading, every boiling, burning, and quartering was a message. The king is watching, and he dreams with a sword in his hand. The Tower of London, once a fortress, became a slaughterhouse of suspicion. Its walls echoed with the screams of the innocent. Its dungeons filled with nobles, poets, monks, and wives, all caught in the gravity of Henry's paranoia. And what did this achieve? Not peace, not loyalty, not security. Instead, it bred a generation of liars, cowards, and survivors, people who learned to smile while they bled, to cheer while their friends were beheaded, to applaud the king's madness, because silence was suicide. This wasn't just monarchy. It was a psychological horror show where the scariest thing wasn't what the king knew, but what he imagined. And still, no one dared to stop him. Because how do you stop a man who believes his dreams are prophecy? How do you question a ruler who thinks his paranoia is divine wisdom? You don't. You bow, you nod, and you pray he doesn't look at you next. Henry VIII didn't just execute traitors, he created them. In his mind, and then in reality, he birthed a system where innocence was irrelevant and guilt was whatever the king needed it to be that day. And the tragedy is, it worked. The fear silenced everyone. The executions made obedience a religion. And the man who dreamed of betrayal became the very betrayal he feared. After nearly 4 decades of blood-soaked rule, Henry VIII finally died. But death, merciful and silent for most, refused to come quietly for England's most feared monarch. His final days weren't a peaceful retreat into old age. They were a slow, public collapse of body, mind, and soul, a horrifying undoing that mirrored the kingdom he had poisoned with fear. By 1547, Henry was no longer a man, he was a monument of rot. His leg ulcers had grown so deep that they exposed bone. His weight had ballooned to nearly 400 pounds, and his body could no longer function on its own. He was so swollen with infection and fluid retention that his skin appeared stretched, waxy, and glowing like a corpse already embalmed before death. Servants no longer served him out of loyalty. They served him because they were afraid not to. And when they wheeled him through the palace, yes, wheeled because he could no longer walk, pieces of him literally fell off. Chunks of dead flesh from his rotting legs would land on the marble floors, leaving a trail of the king's decomposition through the halls of power. A trail that told the truth more honestly than any court historian ever dared. But perhaps the most grotesque part of it all was that he still believed he was in control. Even as he soiled himself, even as his own stench forced attendants to vomit in corners, Henry continued issuing royal decrees. He couldn't sit upright, he couldn't go to the bathroom alone, but he could still sign death warrants, and that's exactly what he did up until the very end. By his final week, the pain had become unbearable. He drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to sleep, haunted not just by physical agony, but by the ghosts of those he'd killed. And when he finally died on January 28, 1547, no one rushed to confirm it, because even in death the king was terrifying. The smell from his body was so overwhelming that his own physicians refused to approach him. It took hours for someone to gather the courage to check for a pulse, and when they did, they found a corpse on the edge of explosion. Literally. Henry's body had become so bloated with post-mortem gases that the royal embalmers had to act fast. They wrapped him in lead sheets and sealed him in multiple wooden coffins, believing that would hold him in. They were wrong. As the funeral procession made its way from London to Windsor Castle through villages, he had ruled past people he had taxed and terrified. The bloated, decomposing king inside the coffin was building pressure. And somewhere along the journey, his coffin exploded. The lead lining buckled, the wooden shell cracked, and pieces of Henry's rotting remains splattered throughout the inside of the royal hearse. The smell was so unbearable the procession had to stop. Servants, noblemen were forced to scrape royal flesh from the walls using rags and buckets. Some reportedly collapsed, others vomited. A few, according to legend, never recovered mentally. But the most haunting image of all, dogs. Stray dogs reportedly followed the trail of the hearse and were seen licking the spilled fluids that had leaked from Henry's coffin onto the road. Let that sink in. The man who had once claimed to rule by divine right, who believed he was chosen by God himself, died so corrupted, so decayed, that even the animals treated him like roadkill. His body, too grotesque for human hands, was left to be consumed by nature. And the symbolism, it couldn't be clearer. Henry VIII, who had devoured everything in his path. Wives, allies, truth, peace had finally been devoured by his own decay. But the horror wasn't over. When they finally buried him at Windsor, they had to dig his grave wider to fit his massive coffin. Even then, the ground beneath it began to collapse as if the earth itself resisted accepting him. For months, there were reports of strange smells near the tomb. Some claimed to hear noises. A few whispered about a curse, but the truth was more mundane and more horrifying. His body was still decomposing at a pace that defied even Tudor expectations. He was too corrupted to rot like a normal man. Even in death, Henry VIII made people sick. Even in death, he terrified those who came near. And if you're thinking this sounds like a scene out of a horror film, you're not wrong. Because this wasn't a funeral. It was a final act of terror. The perfect ending to a reign built on fear, indulgence, and delusion. The king who saw himself as immortal was reduced to a stinking trail of flesh, feared more as a corpse than he had been as a ruler. No eulogy could cleanse the air, no royal rites could sanctify the rot, and as the coffin disappeared into the ground, so did the illusion. The myth of majesty was over. What was left was the truth, a tyrant, a monster, and a man whose soul had decayed long before his flesh. You'd think that after everything Henry VIII did in life, the cruelty, the paranoia, the executions, the rot death would have ended the nightmare. But it didn't. Because long after his coffin burst, long after the smell of his corpse faded from the corridors of power, the trauma he created lived on in the minds of his children. Henry didn't just leave behind a broken kingdom, he left behind broken heirs. Let's start with Mary Tudor, his daughter with Catherine of Aragon. Mary had watched her mother be humiliated, exiled, and slowly driven to death. She saw Catherine stripped of her title, cut off from her child, and left to rot in cold, damp castles, while Henry paraded Anne Boleyn around the court. And when Mary refused to accept that her mother's marriage had been invalid, Henry retaliated like a dictator, not a father. He declared her illegitimate, took away her royal title, barred her from seeing her dying mother. Imagine being a teenage girl forced to publicly deny your own birthright, or risk death at the hands of your own father. Mary didn't just lose a crown. She lost her identity. She lived under constant surveillance, watched by Henry's spies, treated like a political threat. And all the while she had to smile, obey, pretend her father was just, pretend she wasn't slowly being erased. That kind of psychological torment doesn't vanish with a funeral. So when Mary finally became queen, she ruled like someone who had spent her whole life bleeding silently. They called her Bloody Mary, a name soaked in fire and execution. But what they often forget is that Mary didn't invent cruelty. She inherited it. She learned from Henry that power means fear, that mercy is weakness, that people must be punished before they betray you. So she burned Protestants at the stake, tortured dissenters, and tried to rebuild the Catholic world her father had torn apart. But at night, she was alone, married to a man who didn't love her, miscarrying children she would never hold, haunted by the shadow of a father who taught her how to rule, but never how to live. And then there's Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the queen Henry executed when Elizabeth was just 2 years old. She would grow up without a mother, with a father who sometimes acknowledged her and sometimes denied her existence. Her status shifted with the king's moods. One day she was a princess, the next a bastard. She learned early, never get too comfortable, never get too close. The men and women around her vanished overnight, dragged off, beheaded, forgotten. So she adapted. Elizabeth became a master of survival. She wore masks. She spoke in riddles. She trusted no one. She married no one. And when she finally ascended the throne, she ruled England for 45 years, but she ruled it like a woman who knew that love was dangerous, that attachment was vulnerability, that even a crown couldn't protect you from betrayal. If your own father taught you that loyalty meant nothing. Elizabeth surrounded herself with informants. She maintained her own spy network. And like her father, she wielded charm and violence with equal grace. But deep down, the trauma lingered. She once said, "I have the heart and stomach of a king." And she did. But she also had the memory of a girl who watched her mother be murdered by royal decree. Henry VIII raised daughters who would never again trust men, never again trust love, never again trust safety. And how could they? Their father turned affection into a trap. He turned family into politics. He turned the royal nursery into a psychological battlefield. And the legacy: two queens. One burned her enemies alive. The other built walls so high no one ever touched her heart again. This wasn't just about power. It was about pain. And that pain, passed down like a cursed inheritance, defined a generation of rulers. Because when your childhood is shaped by surveillance, betrayal, and public humiliation, you don't grow into a ruler, you grow into a survivor. Henry VIII died in 1547, but the version of him that mattered, the version that wounded his daughters, never left. It lived on in the flames of Smithfield, in the locked bedchambers of Whitehall, in the cold, calculating glances of a queen who never married. This was Henry's true legacy, not reform, not greatness, but generational trauma, wearing velvet robes. A crown passed from hand to hand, still soaked in blood. And as history tried to polish his image with portraits, with poems, with power, it forgot the truth that the people who knew him best were the ones most broken by him. Henry VIII didn't just damage his children. He damaged his kingdom in ways that would echo for generations, because while his body decayed behind palace walls, England was rotting too. He ruled like a god, demanding obedience, rewriting laws, and destroying centuries of tradition in the name of his own desires. And the scars he left behind weren't just emotional. They were political, religious, and economic wounds that would bleed long after he was gone. Let's start with politics. Before Henry, the English nobility was a web of ancient families deeply rooted in the land, loyal to the monarchy, and tied together by generations of intermarriage, service, and diplomacy. But Henry, he burned that structure to the ground. Any noble who questioned him, any family with too much land, too much pride, or too much history was targeted. He beheaded them, exiled them, or confiscated their estates. Entire bloodlines vanished from the peerage, and in their place, he elevated yes-men, opportunists, new families with no legacy but unlimited loyalty. The result, a shattered aristocracy, a court built on fear and flattery, a political culture where ambition was rewarded, not integrity. Future monarchs would inherit this instability. They didn't rule over noblemen with honor. They ruled over sycophants with daggers. It's no coincidence that decades of rebellion plots and civil unrest followed his reign, because once you teach people that survival means betrayal, they never forget. But the deeper wound was spiritual. In 1534, Henry broke from the Catholic Church, not because of theology, but because the Pope wouldn't grant him a divorce. So he made himself supreme head of the Church of England and launched one of the most traumatic religious upheavals in British history. Centuries-old monasteries were dissolved and destroyed, their gold art and sacred relics seized, melted down, and sold, their monks and nuns cast into the streets, executed, or forced to abandon vows they had kept their entire lives. Over 800 religious houses were dismantled. Imagine it. In towns all across England, churches were stripped bare, crucifixes torn down, stained glass shattered. The very places people had gone for comfort, community, and faith turned to rubble at the king's command. And it didn't stop there. Priests were now state agents. Faith became political. And suddenly what you believed in your heart could get you executed. One reign later, under Mary Tudor, Protestants were burned at the stake. After her, Elizabeth restored Protestantism and Catholics were hunted. Back and forth. Back and forth. The result, a century of religious chaos. Neighbors spying on neighbors, families divided by doctrine, mass paranoia justified by godly fear. And all of it traced back to one man's obsession with producing a male heir. But if you think the damage stopped at the soul, just look at the king's wallet, because Henry VIII nearly bankrupted his own kingdom. Despite confiscating all the wealth from the monasteries, an enormous windfall, he spent it all on palaces, on wars, on food, on pageants, on self-worship. He expanded the navy and fought France and Scotland, but with no clear strategy and no long-term economic plan. By the end of his reign, the treasury was drained. England's currency was debased, literally melted down, and reminted with less precious metal, causing rampant inflation. Prices skyrocketed, wages stagnated, grain became scarce, and the people suffered while the king continued feasting on gold-plated meats. And yet no one could stop him, because questioning the king's spending was treason. So his physicians watched him eat himself to death. His nobles watched him waste national wealth. His treasurers counted coins while the country bled, because fear shuts mouths before it saves lives. And the damage didn't vanish with his death. Future monarchs inherited a weakened economy, a divided church, and a nobility torn apart by fear and flattery. Henry VIII didn't build a stronger England. He built a fractured empire glued together by propaganda and silence. And perhaps the greatest irony, all this destruction, all this chaos, was caused by a man who couldn't stand the idea of limits. Limits on his marriage, limits on his power, limits on his appetite, limits on his ego. And when no one dared to say no, he took everything. He took wives, he took lives, he took land, gold, identity, religion, and left behind a nation that no longer knew what it stood for. So while history books may call him great for creating the Church of England or for reforming monarchy, let's not forget what that greatness cost. A kingdom built on fear, a religion built on convenience, an economy built on indulgence, and a legacy built on ashes. History has a strange way of forgiving monsters. It polishes their crowns, it edits their sins, it recasts them as legends. But Henry VIII doesn't deserve that. Because at the end of this story, after the blood, the screaming, the exploding coffin, and the generational trauma, we're not left with a misunderstood ruler. We're left with a question. How did we let this happen? How did a man who rotted while still alive, who executed wives for sport, who destroyed religion for ego, become a pop culture icon? How did we turn a walking cautionary tale into a character on a coffee mug? This isn't just a history lesson, it's a mirror. Because Henry VIII wasn't just one king. He was a template for every kind of power that grows without limits. He ruled with fear because no one told him no. He killed because no one stopped him. He rewrote morality to fit his mood. He made paranoia a national religion, and he did it all while wearing silk jewels and a smug smile. Henry VIII is what happens when power goes unchecked, when accountability disappears, when people learn it's safer to be silent than to speak the truth. And the consequences weren't just historical. They were human. They were children stripped of mothers, women reduced to political pawns, servants forced to mop up royal flesh, towns robbed of their churches, families destroyed because one man had a bad dream. This is what tyranny looks like up close, not in black and white textbooks, but in sweat, blood, silence, and fear. And that fear, it didn't die with Henry. It became a blueprint, one that history would follow again and again and again. Because Henry VIII is every leader who believes they are above the law. He's every system that rewards cruelty and punishes honesty. He's every moment when image matters more than integrity, when we applaud dominance and mistake it for greatness. He is a warning dressed as a king. So here's the real tragedy. Not that Henry existed, but that we, centuries later, still struggle with the very forces that let him thrive. We still let power become performance. We still reward charisma over character. We still ignore warning signs until it's too late. We still romanticize monsters, because the truth makes us uncomfortable. But the truth matters, because the past isn't gone. It's coded into the present. So what do we do with Henry VIII? We don't forget him. We don't whitewash him. We face him and we ask the harder question: are we building systems that prevent monsters or protect them? Because every time we stay silent when someone abuses power, every time we overlook cruelty because it's dressed in charm, every time we choose comfort over courage, we are one step closer to wearing the same crown he did. And that crown, it wasn't made of gold. It was made of fear blood and rotting flesh. Life lessons for today. If there's one thing we must learn from Henry's legacy, it's this: power without accountability always becomes dangerous. Whether it's a king, a CEO, a politician, or a parent, unchecked control breeds abuse. Silence doesn't protect you, it enables the abuser. Everyone at Henry's court thought staying quiet would save them. It didn't. They died anyway, just later and more slowly. Personal trauma, when unhealed, becomes generational destruction. Henry's paranoia came from pain, but instead of facing it, he inflicted it, and his children inherited that pain and passed it on. Legacy is not what you build, it's what you leave behind in others. Henry built palaces, but he left behind fear, and no monument can outshine that truth. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And if we're not careful, if we forget, if we sanitize, if we joke too much, we'll find ourselves laughing at a tyrant until we're living under one. So next time you see Henry VIII on a TV show dancing or smirking, remember the truth beneath the costume. Remember the wives who screamed in silence, the servants who choked on the smell of their king, the children who ruled with shaking hands. And remember this: some monsters don't hide under beds, they sit on thrones, and history only flatters them when we forget the price they made others pay. If this story shocked you, or made you see history in a whole new light, don't just scroll away. Drop a comment below, tell us which part of Henry's legacy disturbed you the most. Save this video so you can revisit it or share it with someone who still thinks he was just a jolly king with 6 wives. And if you want more raw, unfiltered history like this, subscribe to the channel, because the past isn't dead. It's just waiting to be uncovered. And trust me, what's coming next is even darker.